And also, I think there's just a genuine competency crisis in Europe among the political establishment. They're just not very good.
They are hell-bent on keeping this conflict going. And it's actually really scary.
Until Europe gets serious about generating its own hydrocarbons, it is not going to be a geopolitical power that anyone's going to listen to, and it doesn't deserve to be.
Two of my favourite Substackers, Doomberg and the Brawl Street Journal, have recently written about the future of Europe and its predicament in a rapidly changing world. And from their differing perspectives, they both agreed that it is not good. So earlier this week, I brought them together to share their views. One from the perspective of an experienced trade dispute lawyer and former policymaker in Berlin, the other a straight-talking energy analyst and green chicken from his coop in midwestern American flyover country. We discussed the factors that got Europe to this point, the position of Europe in a multipolar world, and how it is struggling to adjust to these new realities. I must warn you that the consequences they draw are not positive for Europe or its institutions, and neither pull any punches in their delivery. In short, they agree that the consequences of current established European policies will likely lead to a collapse of the EU, a consequence of the delusion, incompetence and intransigence of its established political class. But as always, nothing you're about to hear is any kind of advice, but solely for your information and hopefully entertainment. I began by asking them each about the origins of the EU and how Europe got itself into the position it finds itself today. Please enjoy my conversation with Doomberg and Brawlster.
Brought to you by Progressive Equity.
I'd just like to start with a sort of framing question of how did we get here?
So from a high-level perspective, every bureaucracy rewards growth. If you do your job well, you get more staff and bigger budget. And in Brussels, that means more rules, which justify more departments, more funding. And lobbyists thrive in that opacity, how all these technical directives get shaped to their benefit. And of course, it's just speculation, but you can have all kinds of actors hijacking the process and try to push various policies that benefit whoever. And also national politicians, even if they're EU critical, some of them love Brussels because they can always say Brussels made us do it. At least since the great financial crisis, every crisis has become an escalator without treaty change. So after the great financial crisis, you had the ECB's asset purchase program. So essentially the ECB started buying state bonds on the secondary market, blurring the treaty line between monetary and fiscal policy. And then you had the vaccine procurement, for example, during the COVID emergency, and you had the Next Generation Fund, which essentially introduced joint borrowing and was the first step toward a fiscal union without treaty change. You have climate law that entrenched supranational climate targets. So all this led to this ever greater centralization that no one actually voted for. Maybe it's an emergent phenomenon, maybe not only maybe, quite definitely some people benefit very handsomely from that. So that's how I would describe the basic problem that led us here.
Doomberg.
First of all, I agree with everything that was just said, but I would perhaps add two other dimensions to it. It was alluded to the fact that effectively the European Union is illegitimate. Its formation was quasi-legitimate, and what it has become in no way reflects what was sold to the sovereign states during the formation phase. Referendums were ignored or redone multiple times until the right answer was received. So you have that. Then disastrous energy policy. And physics just cannot be overcome. The European Union collectively and several pro-EU states, Germany in particular, have implemented a disastrous energy policy compounded by the war in Ukraine, which history will probably judge could have been handled from a diplomatic perspective in far better ways for the European Union and its strategy than has ultimately unfolded. And now finally, of course, as immigration and energy policies have stirred populist reactionary politics, all manner of anti-democratic tools and tricks are being used by Brussels to try to put the genie back in the bottle. Those won't work. They'll never work. The EU as an entity, we believe, is in its final stages, and what will emerge from its coming collapse remains to be seen. But the current trajectory is unsustainable politically. It's unsustainable from a physics perspective. It's unsustainable from a geopolitical perspective. And it won't go on. That which can't go on forever usually doesn't. And so we suspect the end will be ugly, but the end is near.
Where do you see the breaking point here?
The war in Ukraine and its resolution will be a shattering moment for the European Union. The propaganda surrounding that war and what the people of Europe have been told versus the reality on the ground is almost irreconcilable.
Yeah.
And at some point, when it becomes clear that no, the U.S. isn't going to fund Ukraine anymore, and no, the U.S. can't give weapons to Ukraine anymore because it doesn't have them, the stance towards Russia will require such a dramatic shift that I think wholesale leadership changes are the only path to it. And I don't see the incumbent leaders rushing to leave. I look at Macron, look at Keir Starmer, not the EU, of course, but Ursula von der Leyen, Friedrich Merz. They were all wildly unpopular. They've gone all in on Ukraine, like 100% all in, no compromise. They are currently doing their level best to undermine the upcoming potential meeting between Putin and Trump in Budapest. This is when the wave function collapse must occur, we believe, when the reality of what was invested in Ukraine and what was returned to the European Union becomes clearer to the people and can no longer be hidden by a cloak of propaganda. And so this is our view, our current mental model for why Europe and European leaders are so desperate to stop Trump from cutting a deal with Putin that reflects the realities on the ground. Europe simply does not have the ability to continue this war, and the existing leaders in the EU cannot allow it to end. And that is the big impasse that we think once that cracks, everything else will flow down the river with it.
So I completely agree that this path is unsustainable. And once the Ukraine war ends and the public realizes that all these almost 200 billion euros that have been spent were for nothing, that's going to be a problem. But I think France's debt problem could be the more salient point. So France's debt to GDP ratio is around 115%. And that's on average about the same as the countries that needed bailouts during the Euro crisis. And so the only country that's actually big enough to bail out France is Germany. But doing so would push Germany's own debt to dangerous levels. So last year, the debt to GDP ratio, Germany's was around 65%, I think. And with all the new borrowing for rearmament and then the bailout and all the ongoing spending, it could push Germany to such a level that it might need to bail out itself. But obviously, there is no country that will bail out Germany. And that would lead to the necessity to impose austerity measures. And I would assume that such austerity measures would almost certainly topple the German government, which is already super fragile. And that could lead to an AfD-led government. And this would pull out of the EU, and then the entire structure would collapse.
The war in Ukraine needs to end because Europe can't afford to prop up Ukraine financially. The US is not going to do that. So it's not just the 100 billion in arms that have flown from NATO's inventory, because it doesn't produce that much in the way of its own arms anymore. Most of it is sourced directly or indirectly from China, which is probably something we'll talk about. So where's the 40, 50, 60 billion that Ukraine needs just to pay the civilians and the government workers and whatever percent for the big guy? Because it's not like Ukraine didn't have a notorious reputation for corruption prior to the war. Where this money went is going to be a scandal, a decades-long scandal to be unwrapped. But we're coming to a crisis point fiscally in Ukraine, which is another strain on what is essentially the German printing press, because it's Germany in the end. And that's what makes Germany's energy policy and its disastrous implementation one of the key catalysts for the ultimate undoing of the EU. It may very well be that France pauses it, but France is big enough to bail out and extend and pretend, to kick the ball into the long grass, as I think they say in Britain, when the world sees what actually happened in Ukraine. And look, you get accused of being a Russian stooge if you try to understand what's going on, in the war through independent sources, as we have done for the past 2 years, plus because of just its impact on energy markets, we had to. But you have to understand reality. And I think what's been done in Ukraine, when it all comes out, when the history is written, it'll make for an interesting read, let's put it that way. But I don't know that the Budapest meeting is going to be, hey, we don't even know if it's going to happen. Don't even know how Putin is supposed to get there. I think the war will end because Russia's sending 1,000 drones a night at some point in the next few months into Ukraine. Air defense systems have collapsed. And fiscally, it's a black hole.
In that scenario, how does Europe respond to what effectively becomes an imposed peace?
The way Europe is supposed to respond is that it has a democratic mechanism, and democracy is an input into, national geopolitical questions such as these. But what we see across Europe today, of course, is pro-war Brussels crowd suppressing election results, disqualifying candidates, arresting politicians. This is a really big deal. It's happening in the US, by the way, too. And by the way, what's the point of the meeting in Budapest? Zelensky's already said he is not going to cede 1 inch of territory to Russia, and there's no room for negotiation. And so I don't know how the war doesn't end in a sort of fiscal collapse / military imposition of terms by Russia, and especially if Europe refuses to come around to reality. And one does wonder whether the current batch of European leaders have said these things so many times that they believe it. And also, I think there's just a genuine competency crisis in Europe among the political establishment. They're just not very good. They don't think strategically. When I listen to them talk, they rarely say anything intelligent. And I listened to Robert Habeck. The man was stunning. Lack of knowledge, how industries work, basics of energy, how economies work. This is just an incompetent person. And I think it's okay to say that. And so the current batch of leaders are incapable of recognizing this reality, of confronting this reality, and they are unwilling to leave. And so at some point, something's got to give. They will not agree. They will try to prop up Ukraine once Trump makes it very clear that the U.S. is actually pulling out, which Trump, for some reason, instinctively wanted to do on day one, but has yet to do for internal domestic political pressures, is my guess. And he's also vain and doesn't want to admit that the U.S. was defeated by Russia in the war, because that's really what happened. And so here we are. Now, I think there's a deal to be cut between the U.S. and Russia. I think Russia would be happy if the U.S. just said, we're out and let's do some business. That's probably the deal that's been discussed. The U.S. ceasing support for Ukraine, Russia understanding that it can handle Europe, and the U.S. and Russia forge a new relationship, which I think is why Putin has been holding out, and sort of playing this mirage that somehow the U.S. is not directly involved and is a peacemaker. I mean, the U.S. is a direct combatant in this war, and the two main combatants are the ones that will be meeting in Hungary if it happens.
So I think we've already established that the European leaders, von der Leyen, Merz, and so on, they are hell-bent on keeping this conflict going. And it actually really is scary. So the border, or the potential front line between NATO and Russia, is, I think, 3,000 kilometers long. So there are lots of opportunities where you can manufacture a conflict. And we've seen that with all these recent allegedly drone incursions in the past few weeks. We've seen it with those MiG-31s flying above Estonia. And if you look closer, in my understanding, they flew over Estonia because Estonia redefines their airspace. And if they wouldn't have done so a couple of weeks prior to the event, then they wouldn't have been able to claim that these planes flew over their airspace. So take all that, and if you just read the German press, you constantly get the feeling that they're trying to prepare the broader public that a war with Russia within the next few years is inevitable. It just shows you how resolved they are to keep this thing going. But of course, you can't win a war against such a nuclear power. And if Russia feels pressured, they will have no problem to wipe Germany or Europe from the map. So Germany is NATO's logistics hub. And living in this area and really thinking these things through, it's scary. And it makes you wonder how these people can be this desperate to cling onto power, to keep pursuing this policy. But it feels like they are willing to go the next step, to go on with the next level of escalation. So one of the conservatives just recently said on German TV that we should think about declaring a so-called state of tension. It's like the first step before you actually declare there's a state of war. And it would mean that basic rights can be revoked and you might not be allowed to leave the country anymore. And you might be called on military duties or forced labor even. This kind of rhetoric has never happened in the history of the Federal Republic of Germany. So it's really unprecedented.
I concur. And I think the real amazing part of this is there is no European fighting capacity. I mean, the UK has 70,000 soldiers. How many of those could actually go into combat on short notice? I read with some interest this whole lottery affair in Germany about the conscription. And the people do not want this war. The people do not support this war. And when people like von der Leyen say our democracy, you must emphasize the word our, because the word democracy is undergoing a semantic shift to mean rule by us.
Yeah.
And so, again, there's a very high risk for false flag attacks, which is basically what we're talking about. Russia did not send drones into NATO airspace. Those jets did not fly over Estonia. These hysterias are cooked up in the media to justify more Europe. We need to borrow money to build an EU military that supersedes the sovereign militaries within the 27 member states. This is the long-term plan because the answer to all crises is more Europe. The answer to France will be more Europe. The answer to deindustrialization is more Europe. The Draghi plan, which was really no plan at all, no serious plan. And so the big question is, at what level of provocation does Russia decide to make a demonstration? Because Russia would, I believe, defeat NATO in Europe rather easily, given the current state of affairs. We think in mental models at Doomberg, and a mental model is an axiom that is currently working to explain the world. And one of our mental models is that missile technology is outpacing missile defense technology, and Russia is a leader in this regard. China is a leader in this regard. And the driving factor for Trump's desire to end the war is the fact that the U.S. is chronically short on air defense missiles, air defense missile launchers, and air defense technology. The U.S. is rumored to have spent 20% of its THAAD missiles in the short 12-day war between Israel and Iran at a far higher rate than they're produced.
Yeah.
And there is no defense to the Orezhnik missile, which Russia has demonstrated in Ukraine and claims that it is now in serial production, hundreds of missiles in their inventory. There will come a point where a false flag by the Europeans, probably the British would be behind it, will cause Russia to make a statement, a military statement. And then the last thing I would say is contrary to how Putin is portrayed in the Western propaganda, the real risk of a coup in Russia is from the right. It's from the hardliners.
Yeah.
And the person who would replace Putin would, I suspect, have far less tolerance for the shenanigans of European leaders as they exist now. And that would be very dangerous. Then there would be a real risk of war in our view.
How do you see the sort of wider implications of all this, particularly given the ceasefire that we've seen in the Middle East and some sort of jockeying for position, I would say, between some of the main players in that region that seem to be, Saudi Arabia seems to be straddling two horses at the moment. You know, this is this sort of global entropy point that Marvin Barth has been talking about.
Our broader framework is that the U.S. and its allies have been in World War III since around 2014. The Crimea affair and the subsequent sanctioning of Russia triggered Russian leaders to dump U.S. treasuries and buy gold. And that was the beginning of World War III, in our view. And the war in Ukraine is just a significant battle in World War III. The trade war with China should be viewed through that lens. It's a war between the U.S. and its allies and the BRICS countries, to be very clear. It's no surprise that Brazil and India are high on Trump's list for tariffs. India, we did a Doom Zoom Pro tier presentation last month called Losing India, the geopolitical and energy impacts of this decaying relationship between India and the US. It seems to be a bit on the mend now. We believe that recognizing what has occurred in Ukraine and China winning the trade war, which they will be the end of World War III. And let's just hope it never escalates to nuclear. But the US simply does not have escalation dominance militarily against Russia or economically against China. And we have a piece coming out tomorrow. We just published a piece earlier that the events of last week have changed everything. The rare earth move by China was an economic nuclear weapon that it threatened. The seizing of Nexperia, which is what we're writing about tomorrow, it exposed a shocking lack of forethought and chess playing on the part of the US and Europe, as though China wasn't going to take devastating reciprocal action in light of that move. And so the broader view, to sort of finalize the answer, is if you look at Saudi Arabia, a global supplier of oil, it would like to see to the other side of World War III without having to pick a side. That gives it maximum strategic flexibility to participate in whatever order emerges from the end of World War III, which we think is near. And so that's our sort of broader view. When we see what's going on with China and we watch the gold markets, that's where we think we are. But, the current sort of Western financial system is unsustainable. Debt levels, austerity, you name it. And so something has to come out the back end of that. It's like trying to figure out what happens after a singularity in physics. The laws of physics break down temporarily, and then we'll see what happens on the other side of it. But yeah, we're in World War III, and having that as a framework allows you to absorb the news in a more meaningful way, in our view.
And which way does Europe jump on this, do you think, Brawlster?
I mean, for China, it makes sense if the European Union just continues in its ways, so that it doubles down on renewables, buys all its solar panels and batteries from China. So Trump, in contrast, I mean, for him, the European Union might as well not exist. He just treats each country on a bilateral basis, and it just creates the facts in a way that might eventually contribute to the European Union breaking up. But from China's perspective, it's probably easier to deal with the European Union as a whole because it's not a threat, but at the same time, it's a huge market. That doesn't erase Europe's fiscal problems. So, I mean, the crazy thought experiment is if China would bail out a European country just so they could keep continuing doing their crazy politics that benefit China. But as Doomberg says, it's like a singularity. You don't know what will come after it.
Presumably Trump has decided that if he is going to talk to Putin, he's going to talk to him in Budapest. Now, as you say, we don't know if that's going to take place. We don't know if or how Putin gets to Budapest. But Budapest has been picked for a reason, hasn't it?
Viktor Orban is close to Trump, has clearly been talking to Trump in the background, was in Mar-a-Lago before Trump was inaugurated, I believe. And Viktor Orban is the kind of leader that Trump respects. And I think the overlap in the diagram of the average Orban voter and the average MAGA voter is comprehensive. Christian, family values, anti-woke, all that stuff that resonates with Trump. And elections still have consequences for now. And Trump's reascension to the Oval Office was earth-shattering, of course. And so why Hungary breaks the glass on a few things that were thought to be sort of impossible. Putin visiting a NATO country, Putin visiting an EU country with this arrest warrant hanging out there. It's the end of the ICC, of course. And so long shot reason for us is that Trump hates the EU and doesn't think it needs to exist. And Hungary is the weakest link of the current members. I think Hungary is a country that could leave the EU. And that would be a reasonably popular decision in the country. The upcoming election, where Brussels will do everything in its power to see Orban lose, is sort of the next electoral war to be fought. And so they're going to go all out to defeat Orban. And Trump is showing his support for Orban. How's that going to look domestically in Hungary to have Putin and Trump and Orban together in Budapest? I mean, talk about great pictures for Orban. If you were looking to launch your re-election campaign. By the way, Orban has been trying to end this war before it was popular. And if anybody actually deserves a Nobel Peace Prize in the way it used to be defined, I would argue that Orban would be a fine candidate for it.
So I guess it also begs the question of how Europe's new right evolves. The national leader in the most powerful position at the moment is Giorgia Meloni. And I just wonder what your thoughts were, Brawlster, about how the new right parties in France and Germany over the next few years might evolve to emulate what she's done.
First of all, they need to somehow come to power. In other words, the election results would need to be respected in a way. So the AfD is reaching new poll highs all the time. I think on federal level right now they are 27%. And in the state of Saxony-Anhalt, it's even at 40%. So there's clearly the will of the voters to end certain policies. The AfD, at least what they claim, is that they essentially want to leave the European Union. They want to have it as a free trade area. And also one factor that plays a role is that Germany is the biggest net contributor of EU funds. And it's just as a side note, also, I think a reason why Orban, for the time being, is unlikely to actually leave the European Union, because 3% of Hungary's GDP are made up of these EU funds the country receives. So he would be walking away from free money at the moment. So maybe he's just waiting out for things to disintegrate. And until that happens, he gets all the benefits he can get. Then there are these weird tactical considerations playing a role, because let's take the firewall against the conservatives in Germany uphold against the AfD. So they say we will never work with them. And at the same time, the left, they keep talking about banning the AfD, but tactically it's not in their interest to actually ban the AfD, because then the conservatives would get these voters back. So they need this rhetoric of how dangerous they are to be there as long as the firewall exists. But at some point, the pressure will erupt on the streets, like you've seen in Britain with Unite the Right protests.
Yeah.
Then you also have these NGOs that are actually GOs because they receive state funding, and they put up these protests that the media blows up disproportionately to make it seem like the entire country is of the belief that these policies should be continued as they are. But I think people notice that they're manipulated on a massive scale, and you can only do that for so long before the entire edifice collapses.
UGPS, another Substack writer, had an interesting post on the firewall over the weekend and how it's basically a liberal Green Party dream. You have a country that is 65% conservative lean right. And if you look at, CDU, CSU, AfD polling it's polling about 50% for sure. And yet the remnants of Olaf Scholz's party is still in power. This is the consequence of the firewall. It is highly anti-democratic. And just to give you a sense of how out of touch the EU is, so as we're recording this, Kaja Kallas, whose job shouldn't exist, is announcing the formation of what amounts to a European version of the ICC to hold Putin accountable for war crimes. And this is announced now, a week or two before Putin is to meet the US president in Hungary. This is no coincidence. This is all about sabotaging the peace process to keep the war going. And why is Kaja Kallas, of all people, committing effectively Germany to war with Russia? What do you think the reaction in Moscow is going to be to these things? There's going to come a point, this is sort of, again, we try to think laterally around here, where China says to the US, get the Europeans in order, drop all the sanctions against Russia in Iran, or we're just going to sit on all the rare earths and shut down your economy. It's not just that China will limit its demands to Chinese interests. China gets its oil from Russia. China gets its oil from Iran. China gets its oil from Venezuela. There's no coincidences. And China, I think, has said it's had enough. All of a sudden, of course, we're seeing all these rumors about Xi Jinping and, purges in the military. These types of things circulate on Twitter every 3 months. Who knows? Maybe this is the one time they'll be true and it's not a psyop. But we're at a really critical moment. And here's Kaja Kallas rolling out the 19th sanctions package, which this time will work, and setting up a war crimes tribunal outside of the ICC to try Vladimir Putin. How is this conducive to ending the war?
So it begs the question in terms of your World War III framework, Doomberg, that what is the prospect of a grand bargain on November the 6th, I think it is, between Trump and Xi?
So there is a thermodynamically favorable grand bargain to be had, which is spheres of influence. Western Hemisphere, nuclear détente. There's plenty for the U.S. to do at home. And so the grand bargain is China gets Taiwan, Russia gets its security pact. Who knows what happens to Europe? Who cares what happens to Europe, I suppose, if you're Trump and Putin and Xi? Because they're just not serious people. You might care what happens to individual countries within Europe, but the European Union itself, I mean, the way China treats the EU leaders when they arrive in the country is quite humorous, actually. And so that's the grand bargain. The U.S. can't win a kinetic war against either China or Russia, certainly not a conventional one. It still, of course, is a nuclear power. It's still a financial superpower. It's an global energy gigapower. And so the grand bargain is there. The U.S. needs to rebuild its manufacturing might because it has lost it. And as a consequence, it's lost its military-industrial complex. Can't make weapons at the rate at which they are expending them, which is why the war in Ukraine needs to end from Trump's perspective. He said as much when the whole Tomahawk theater finally came to its predictable close. The U.S. was never going to send Tomahawk missiles to launch into Russia. Let's be clear. Even Biden wouldn't do that. So Trump was never going to do that. And so, there's a grand bargain. If Trump had political freedom, he would strike it. He does not have political freedom. There's a civil war going on in the U.S. right now, which is probably something we should talk about. But there is a fight to the bitter end going on in the U.S. right now. One of our mental models that we're going to talk about in our upcoming Doom Zoom is the U.S. has begun arresting former presidents.
Okay.
The U.S. began arresting former presidents in 2023 when whoever was running the Biden administration decided to arrest Trump. That's a very hard process to stop, and it very quickly leads to single-party rule because existing presidents don't want to go. And Trump needs to win that civil war before he can strike the grand bargain, and that civil war is heating up. We noted with interest the discovery of a hunting blind within line of sight of where Trump lands in Florida, that this would be the third or fourth attempt that we know of on the man's life. So we don't model Washington as Democrat or Republican. It's uniparty and outsider. And 80% of Washington is neocon, unique party, pro-war, delusional in its internal framing of U.S. power. And Trump and the MAGA movement is opposed to that. Trump was elected on a platform of peace. And so the Lindsey Grahams of the world hold significant power. The lobbyists in D.C., who knows what the whole Epstein affair is actually all about and who's on what list and who's in what photographs. Let's just do a thought experiment. Imagine the Democrats take back power. How many members of Trump's current cabinet would be arrested? Everybody's going to get arrested. So they're not going to leave. Like, that's just one of our axioms. Like, there will not be another peaceful presidential transition in the United States.
The polarization of society is obvious, and the mere fact that many people can't even talk to each other without portraying the other side as pure evil is really something remarkable that probably is playing out in the entire Western world right now. Families fighting over Thanksgiving dinner, who's voted for Trump or won't even invite their family members if he has voted for Trump. It's probably similar in Germany and I suppose in other...
It's definitely the case in the UK.
Yeah. In the end, it's always about money and power and who can influence the broader public to sway into the direction they want them to sway.
Your point, Doomberg, about regional spheres of influence. I'm fascinated by the prospect of regime change in Venezuela.
When you understand that the U.S. is in a civil war, Marco Rubio is a charter member of the Uniparty, and his appointment as Secretary of State raised a few eyebrows in the MAGA movement. You could view what's going to happen in Venezuela as the grand bargain with the neocons that, yes, we're going to cut a deal with Russia, but don't worry, you'll get your war over here, and we'll get oil as a prize. When you're in the bomb-making business, peace is a working capital problem. And so there's always got to be a place to dump your inventory. And talk about planned obsolescence, right? You drop a bomb, you need another one because it's literally exploded. And so we wrote a piece on Trump's inauguration called Misreading the Room. And it was about Maduro's bluster. So Marco Rubio, born to Cuban immigrants, very strongly anti-Castro, anti-communist party in Cuba. Cuba's on our radar for another regime change operation. We note with interest that suddenly their electricity grid is in another serious crisis. So if you just look up and down Central and South America, you see Argentina, Vaca Muerta, could be a 4 to 5 million barrel a day shale asset. You look at Venezuela, the world's largest hydrocarbon deposit. You look at Guyana, which Venezuela claims as its own, by the way, approaching 1 million barrels a day with the armada of super majors there. You look at Colombia, which has oil and gas potential. You look at Brazil, crossing 4 million barrels a day. You look at Canada, obviously, Alberta, British Columbia. You have already the Western Hemisphere outproduces the Middle East in oil and vastly outproduces the Middle East in natural gas. And so look at Mexico. We wrote an interesting piece about the cartel involvement in the Mexican oil and gas industry, that if that gets cleaned up, I mean, you could see 10 million incremental barrels of oil coming out of the Western Hemisphere if the U.S. sort of decided it wanted to do it. And so we view Venezuela as Rubio bridging the neocons into accepting a settlement with Russia that leads to trade. Everybody gets rich, and don't worry, you can still drop your bombs over here. I know that's probably cynical, but one can't be too cynical. And by the way, we like to say about our mental models, they don't have to be right, they just have to work. Clearly, our mental model around the Western Hemisphere, if we go back and look at what we wrote and what has since transpired, is a pretty effective one. It's currently working, and so we don't abandon it until it stops working.
So that doesn't only beg questions about what happens to Europe, but it also begs questions about what happens to the Middle East. Does the US need Saudi Arabia as its forever ally in that scenario?
So peace in the Middle East is a military necessity in our view. Again, back to our perhaps controversial assessment of why the war with Iran had to come to a close. That's kind of China's problem to police, in our view, in that grand bargain, because it gets its oil from the Middle East. And so I think in a world where a grand bargain such as this is achieved, the US has no need to police the Middle East and shouldn't have the desire to.
Which is the bigger worry, the bubble in gold or the bubble in AI?
The bubble in AI is a traditional boom-bust cycle that we've seen before countless times. That's normal. What's not normal is the price of gold more than doubling in the global reserve currency in a span of 15 months. That usually foretells significant political and geopolitical change. The Trumpian vision of U.S. revitalization cannot occur within the current structure. And so that structure needs to change. The U.S. military would like it to change. And the U.S. need no longer be the sort of, let me say it in Luke Groman speak, the U.S. Treasury debt can no longer serve its role as a neutral reserve asset for the settlement of imbalances in international trade. And so therefore a new one is needed. And if you look, I love these kind of calculations because they're always so elegant. The value of Russia's gold holdings at the end of 2022 has increased by more than what the Europeans are holding in Euroclear today.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Yeah.
And this is one of those elegant, feels right mathematical insights. And if you look, when did the price of gold start really taking off? December of 2023, when the Ukrainian counteroffensive failed. Okay. And that's when it was clear that Russia was going to win the war. And that was when it became clear that a new financial architecture was going to be needed.
Brawlster, any finishing comments? Us guys sitting in Europe, how do you feel about it?
I wonder if that, assuming there's a regime change at some point in Germany and France, with leaders that aren't hell-bent on continuing the war, I'm wondering how that might affect the energy balance in Europe. So at least since the Cold War, the geopolitical structure was always to keep Eurasia fractured. So the US never wanted Russia get too close to Europe and to Germany. And when Trump said back in 2018 that Russia will hold Europe and Germany hostage, you have to view that through this framework that he doesn't really care about Europe and Germany being held hostage. He didn't want this balance of power to shift. And I wonder if at some point Trump or the US stops caring about that, and it might be more in the US's interest to pull Russia out of China's orbit. And to do that, they want hydrocarbons going from Russia to Europe. So earlier this year, you had the Nord Stream 2 infrastructure being auctioned off. they prepared to auction it off. And then you had this mysterious investor from the US that paid off the small claim creditors and apparently paid enough to the big creditors for them to stop the proceedings. And no US investor does that without the US government allowing them to do it. I wonder if that might be something for Trump and Putin to discuss, because if Trump wants, he can twist even current leaders' arms in Europe to start buying Russian gas again. Just some concluding thoughts on how this might play out in the future, maybe.
I think last time we spoke, you said you would be buying Liberty gas.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Trump could
presumably with a Trump tariff
exactly.
On the a take rate to help make it happen for us.
And like with diminishing interest the US has in the Middle East, this could also be a result of this reorientation. But we'll see how it will play out.
On the other side of the singularity, maybe. Doomberg, what about you? Any finishing thoughts?
It's really fascinating to study the European Union because it is just such a prime example of physics gone awry. And to put some numbers to it, the Statistical Review of World Energy, which is our Bible, comes out every June. They've now started separating out the European Union, the 27 member states, and aggregating their contribution to global energy. And we run the numbers, and each year Europe buys 38 exajoules of hydrocarbons, but only produces 5. So it consumes 38 exajoules and only produces 5. It's a global energy vassal, unlike anything the world has ever seen. It is utterly dependent on other nations for its energy. And so that makes it powerless. That makes it unable to sustain heavy industry, which then makes it unable to sustain effective militaries. And yet it's still acting and behaving and trying to position itself as though it matters. And it doesn't. And unless and until that changes, and think of how far away from that we are, until Britain starts drilling again and the giant gas fields are turned back on and coal is accepted again because there's a lot of it, this is not going to change. And so until we see that number change, the train hurtling towards the wall continues to accelerate. So you can quantify when Europe is going to change, and you could see it every year in the numbers. The current batch of leaders seem so far away from recognizing reality that it doesn't give one much hope to call a bottom. Insanity. But this too shall pass. Until Europe gets serious about generating its own hydrocarbons, it is not going to be a geopolitical power that anyone's going to listen to, and it doesn't deserve to be. So,
what an uplifting note to end on. But guys, thank you very much for joining. It's been a fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot. And hopefully we can catch up on this subject in the not too distant future. See you in the singularity or beyond.
Thank you.
Brought to you by Progressive Equity.